Hello, my name is Dr. Sam Grant, and I'm here this evening to talk to you about social somatics as a pathway towards mutual liberation and a counter to the way we internalize racism and begin to reinforce it in ways within and outside of our awareness. So I'm going to share my screen with you and just dive into this presentation because I need to try and cover a fair amount of ground in just 20 minutes or so. So the social somatics of race and structural disembodiment, looking at the interplay of racialized embodiment and transformative praxis in the 21st century. Wouldn't it be nice to live in a world where we loved each other within and across our differences? So you see a heart over here in terms of the world structure. We're not living in a world structure that's guided by the heart chakra and guided by relationships as something that matters as a core value guiding all of our lives and processes as human beings. We internalize the system we're a part of. As it shapes us, we then offer shape to it based on that internalization or our rejection of that internalization. To the extent that we haven't yet successfully transcended what we've internalized from racism, we develop a racially embodied persona, which means we're shaped by the legacies of racism in our own bodies and through our own relationships. And many of us might say, we have nowhere we can go outside of a racialized reality. It may be fair to go as far as to say there's a very basic continuum of layers of racialization through which we live too much of our shared lived experience. Ted Cross had developed a racial identity scale, and I'm sort of making a hybrid model of that here and suggesting there's a pre-racialized stage of innocence that many, but not all children have, because many are born into a self-similar world where they are surrounded and appreciated by people who look like them. But as they grow up, they begin to realize that there's water, there's air in the world that's based on race. And we become racially deposed as we recognize that we're not living in a world of our own design and collaborative making, but we're living in a world which has over-determined that white supremacy culture is going to sort of drive normalizing conditions across the planet. As we recognize that that's unacceptable to us and we fight back against it with different orientations to anti-racism, some that just ask for equality within the system of oppression without really thinking beyond borders to the well-being of all of life, all people, all places, all ecologies on the whole planet. As we get past narrow anti-racism work and go deeper, some of us begin to transcend racialized embodiment and set to seek conditions for decolonization of all of our relations. And that starts with an internal process of decolonization in ourselves and our core relationships. As we do that and extend into broader and broader networks of relation around the world, we begin to build the skills to practice mutual liberation. And we have to create infrastructures through which that mutual liberation can be experienced, can be documented, can be tested and refined, and then shared once we trust, oh yeah, we have designed and defined something that we think we want other people in the world to check out and see whether or not they resonate enough with it to join us here as partners. When we don't practice partnership across our differences, we have created a really violent world system that Frantz Fanon very clearly, broke down in Black Skins, White Masks, and in Wretched of the Earth. In Black Skins, White Masks, he talks about if you are colonized, you are put into the zone of non-being, which means your humanity is refuted. And when we live in a world ecology that refutes the humanity of any of us, all of us are dehumanized. None of us can be fully human in a world in which we don't recognize each other as relatives. And this pattern in the world, I like to think of as a pattern of structural violence. Johann Galtung, sort of developed a theory of structural violence. And I'm taking that notion and looking at racism itself as a manifestation of structural violence. It's not the only manifestation of structural violence. It's intersecting with many other forms of structural violence, patriarchy, xenophobia, and the list goes on. We people who are colonized are forcibly removed from our own self-determination. And that also includes being forcibly removed from our land and forcibly made to stop practicing our cultures. The American Indian community, as an example, in the United States was forced to stop practicing their religion. They had to practice it only in private until 1978, when the American Indian Religious Freedom Act was passed. We're forcibly removed from self-determination, and then we're recontextualized as beings within the paradigm of other beings who have a power system that relegates us to less than equal status, structurally and culturally. We suffer cultural genocide, meaning they say the person can live, but we're going to take the culture out of the person, and the person is going to be forced to assimilate to our cultural norms in order to be accepted as human. And if we fight back against that imposition of a toxic, colonizing culture, then we risk physical genocide. We risk annihilation. And if we think about the experience of Africans, stolen from Africa and put into the Middle Passage to come across the ocean and become slaves in the Americas, how many lives were lost in that passage, and how many lives were lost during the violent encounter in which they destroyed local cultures and forced people into an economy of rupture that was facilitating the slave trade. Similarly, in the United States of America, some scholars report that there may have been up to 75 million American Indians genocided by war and disease from 1492 to the present, given settler colonialism. So to transcend these norms of genocide and racism, we have to organize to transcend structural violence. And we have to work through and against the adaptive capacity of systems of oppression. And we found that all of these systems of oppression have a greater level of resilience than any of us would like to see. They don't just go quietly into the night. And they facilitate an ecosystem of harm that keeps a lot of us from developing the level of critical embodied consciousness to be a resource for shared transformation or mutual liberation. So identity oppression, economic oppression, political repression and oppression, cultural oppression, and then the internalization of that in our own bodies and in all of our relationships. This mantra of "we can't breathe," coming from the Black Lives Matter movement, pushes us to think about the nexus of racialized capitalism, democracy, education, healthcare, and safety. Who gets to be safe in a racialized political ecology? Certainly not those of us in colonized bodies who are defined as the most extreme other. So trans people, Black people, American Indian people are put on the hard periphery of this racialized system. But this racialization disembodies all of us because it refutes the truth of the complexity of the human being. And when whites internalize it, it dehumanizes them, and given the beneficial, political ecology of whiteness built into a white supremacy culture across the United States and around the world, conditions are set to socially reproduce whiteness and to reproduce this othering of people who don't fit the definition of the privileged humanity. And then for those of us who aren't part of that privileged humanity, we internalize a form of self-diminishment. And if we have spaces outside of direct attack or direct encounter, in those spaces, we learn to code switch, places where we can breathe a little bit more, laugh a little bit more, cry a little bit more, be a little bit more our full selves. But we have to adjust and practice a double life, the way that, W.E.B. Du Bois talked about it brilliantly in 1903 with the souls of Black folks. So transcending this requires us to understand the cycle and systems of oppression and how they get internalized in us. Ricky Sherover Marcuse, who developed this model of unlearning racism, gave us a gift of one way to get at this. So we start with different assumptions, which get racially embodied. Those become different racial role expectations, which become embodied, which shapes different treatment of each of us, which is racially embodied. And over time, when you're treated in a particular way, you internalize that and you begin acting according to an external message, which is now working through you. Stephen Biko had a way of explaining this that I find is just so apt. I've been saying this over and over again since I first learned of it in the early 1980s. The most potent weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed. And as I've come to recognize the necessity of embodied approaches to liberation, I'm adding to his sentiment here that the greatest weapon in the hands of the oppressor is the mind of the oppressed, and saying it's the bodies of the oppressed that hold us in place and keep us in harm's way. So when we take our bodies back and we say we're not available to participate in anything thrown at us from systems of oppression, we're going to practice freedom here, and we're going to invite you to share that practice with us. Martin Luther King Jr. said clearly two things which I want to share. One, that once they've got you bent over, then they've really got you. So how many of us can say that we're living our lives kind of hunched over, not feeling like we're able to be our full selves in this world anymore, that our full self is not welcomed? We've created that, and we can uncreate that and replace that with something else. We just have to have the audacity to choose and enact in relationship to each other. We can't do it alone. We got to do it in relation. Ubuntu, I am because we are. When we don't practice that relational healing, we set up a situation where a blind spot gets revealed to us late in life. Not long before he was assassinated, Martin Luther King, shared this sentiment: "I'm afraid I've been encouraging people to integrate into a burning house." He recognized, with the profound intersectionality in his Beyond Vietnam speech in 1967, that militarism, which is organized structural violence in the interest of elite power, colonial and imperial and racialized capitalist power, was one of the three legs of an evil stool. And another is poverty, which is mass impoverishment of people. And another is racism. So he said, these three things, we got to heal through them, and we got to let them go, or we won't have a beloved community. So how do we get to the beloved community? It's through the practice of social somatics, or mutual liberation praxis. I'm going to share with you 5 basic principles of this journey. Number 1 is principled struggle. There is a critical relationship between the organic process of the arising of critical consciousness in the heat of principled struggle, and the crystallization of this consciousness in between those spaces of heat and friction, where reflection, breath, space, a little bit of ease and community can carry us to the deep depth of analysis that advances our capacities to struggle forth more wisely. This is one of the core principles. The second core principle is the principle of relational healing justice. To sustain principled struggle, we have to embody the discipline of nourishing our own health and the health of all of our relations. Sounds beautiful, doesn't it? The dance of living well together. If we do not embody health, we cannot bring health to movements. It is through countering intersectionally embodied racism that we become disembodied from our authentic selves. Through relational healing justice, we co-create pathways to shared health. The third principle is the song line, or the dream that we hold up, or the coherent vision that we hold up of the world we wish to see. It's the melody of the struggle, and it's the strange attractor that brings people across our differences together to organize, heal together, and nourish conditions for a mutual, liberation future. And it's the nexus and the mixing of transformative art expression and transformative science, the constant braiding of artistic expression and scientific, knowledge production across our cultural distinctions is key to shaping deeper democracy and ecologically sound outcomes. We have to generate liberation zones, places where the norms that normalize race, thinking and practice, reinforcing structural racism, there have to be places where that's not only disrupted, but where it's not normalized, where it doesn't exist as what's driving what we're doing to interact, in a human system. So these places of shared liberation are places, some people call them third spaces, if you follow the work of Homi Bhabha and some of the other, cultural theorists, places where reality is collectively shaped in a democratic way, and it's not owned by anybody. So in these places, we can innovate and we can test ideas until we feel like, okay, this is ready for extension. We want to invite other people to check this out and consider joining us here. And the final principle, the fifth principle, is the braiding principle. To share liberation is to braid our understandings of the world and experience with others across all of our conditioned divides. We have to braid with each other at a transformative pace, which means we have to learn in our interactions with each other at a pace that allows us to transcend the norms of oppression at increasing scope and scale. At the braiding point, there are two patterns that have to find each other and work out the terms of their relationship. This is the connection between the bonding in communities of high agreement and bridging communities with only moderate to low agreement or low coherence. My great friend and poet, Kirk Washington Jr., said, "We already know how to be divided. I want to know, how can we truly come together?" And this is a match for what Vandana Shiva talks about in her excellent work on eco-apartheid, which is based on our division from nature, our divisions from each other, and the internalization of living in a world of division within our own consciousness and our own behavior that prevents us from healthy human relational behavior. So how do we transcend all of these negative, toxic, degenerative norms? Amilcar Cabral provides the answer that I resonate with. We have to return to the source of our own deeper cultural knowings before the internalization of toxic colonization. And then we have to shape an upwards path with people who want to walk next to us as our accomplices, and we're accomplices to them. We're co-creating conditions for a healthier life. And in order to do that, we have to generate together some zones of creative, cultural, and cross-cultural liberation. As we do that, and we trust, we're figuring this out, this feels right, this feels different, it feels like something we want to share, then we foster the extension with the braiding principle to bring more people into alignment and relationship with us around shared values for common wellness of all of life, and we foster conditions for mutual liberation. There's many kinds of thinking we have to do to embody and share relationally this approach. We have to think about who we are in relation to other people subjectively. We have to think about how we are part of orientations in the world, or cosmologies in the world, or cultural streams in the world. And each of these cultural streams looks at the world in a slightly or significantly different way than others. And so we have to sort of compare notes of how we see the world over here and how you see the world over here. Different cultures embody different behavioral sets on the planet. Some practice a form of deep reciprocity with all of life, and they really care for the earth as though the earth is an entire sacred being of which they are a part. Others think about the earth as a tool just to use and discard, in the same way that many people treat slaves and colonized bodies and gendered bodies as things to use and discard. All of these subjective realities and objective realities are organized into intersecting systems all over the planet. We have to ask questions as well of those intersecting systems. The gift of integral psychology is to give us these 8 irreducible perspectives that we have to examine in the work of mutual liberation. How do I see the world, and how do I see my view of the world in relation to yours? How do people who I feel are part of my we see the world in relation to people who you see as part of your we in the world? How are the people in my we behaving in the world? And how does that relate to the way people who are in your we are behaving in the world? And then how are we creating and experiencing the systems that are collectively shaping all of our lives and the conditions that are differential for our lives because of all of the toxic dynamics of racial oppression, gender oppression, geographic oppression, so on and so forth. I want mutual liberation. And I do believe deeply that no one is free when others are oppressed. And I wonder if you experience this as an antiquated notion that doesn't make any sense in this crazy world of ours anymore, whether or not you join with me in believing, you know what, we do have to create sufficient conditions for intercultural dialogue to reach scope and scale across the planet and bring us towards a healthier way of sharing this, beautiful planet with each other. And I'll close with this perspective from Robin Wall Kimmerer in Braiding Sweetgrass, where she talks about the 7th prophecy. So the 7th prophecy presents a vision that we're in a time in which the people of the earth have to choose whether we want to burn up or we want to facilitate nourishing of all of life. The choice is ours. We're in this time space of the global planetary crisis of climate change, wealth inequality, income inequality, the water crisis, the soil crisis, the biospheric crisis in terms of loss of biodiversity, and the list goes on. How do we heal and move towards a different vibration that shapes different outcomes for all of life on the planet? Here in this dialogue on embodiment and race, I suggest we should consider moving towards an intercultural, ecological, democratic process of evolution. We have to ask ourselves, what does it mean to be the people of the seventh fire, to walk back along the ancestral road and pick up what was left behind? How do we recognize what we should reclaim and what is dangerous refuse? What is truly medicine for the living earth and what is a drug of deception? None of us can recognize every piece, let alone carry it all. We need each other to take a song, a word, a story, a tool, a ceremony, and put it in our bundles. Not for ourselves, but for the ones not yet born, for all our relations, collectively from that wisdom of the past, a vision of the future, a worldview shaped by mutual flourishing. Ending racism is a journey long in coming. And I want to suggest that the time is now. And we are the people who collectively will bring racism down and compost it. And as compost, it can do something beneficial in the soil that will help us to grow seedbeds of a nourishing future for all people in light of our differences, bringing love to our differences and honoring the laws of nature and working with the natural systems that we're part of and fostering mutual flourishing. So let's come together and make it happen. Thank you for your time.